Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, black gold in the Gulf of Mexico and dark days for BP's PR.
Why wasn't something ready to go in the event of this kind of a disaster?
Is WikiLeaks paying the price in Australia for blowing the whistle? Why is it that when journalists get kidnapped, their stories tend to go untold?
I am surprised because as a journalist, I'd want to report on it.
And delinking from sites like Facebook.
Slowly you see your online life passing away.
The social networking suicide mission.
My internet life is dying, but my real life is starting.
When crisis hits, headlines follow, and the headlines in the aftermath of last month's oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico were unrelenting. The explosion of an offshore drilling rig, part owned by BP, has spilled enough crude oil into the Gulf to become the largest such disaster in American history. For BP, it was a public relations nightmare come to life. The company had an environmental and economic catastrophe on its hands, and the U.S. government, the affected communities, and all kinds of Americans pointed the finger at the energy giant. BP's brand has taken a beating, so has its stock price, and Big Oil will tell you that public perception is vital to its business. Our starting point this week is a crippled drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico, and the coverage of a story that has proved toxic to BP in many more ways than one.
Massive oil spill in the Gulf, which is now 130 miles long, 70 miles wide.
First came the environmental calamity.
The mess in the Gulf where oil has now been spewing into the water.
Then for BP, the public relations disaster, most of it self-inflicted.
Does your company take 100% responsibility for this leak?
This is not our accident, but it's our responsibility to deal with it.
The message was repeated like a mantra for the media.
It wasn't our accident, but we are...
And it was clear that no matter what it said, the company could not wash its hands of the spill.
But we are responsible for the oil and for dealing with it and cleaning the situation up.
In the panicky aftermath, BP made enemies in the media. The company's lawyers tried to get local fishermen to sign legal waivers, promising they would not speak to journalists.
There's no great way of dealing with a crisis. Something of this magnitude is actually threatening to the very existence of BP. They tried to sort of say, well, it wasn't our rig, it wasn't our people.
The drilling rig was a Transocean drilling rig. It was their rig and their equipment that failed.
Of course, people don't want to hear that. They want to hear the concern. They want to see action in terms of what are you going to do about it.
What BP did was a clumsy exercise in damage control. It tried to downplay the scale of the disaster. Shortly after the rig exploded, BP issued a statement pegging the daily release of oil at 1,000 barrels. It was not true. BP was called out by SkyTruth, an environmental awareness group that used satellite mapping to make a more accurate assessment of the damage.
The amount of oil leaking into the ocean is not 1,000 gallons a day, as originally thought, but 5,000.
The estimates grew larger and larger when, under pressure from the U.S. government and the media, BP finally released underwater footage of oil gushing out of the seabed.
It's certainly going to be more than 5,000 now that we've had the video of the gusher. It's not a spill, it's gushing.
Today, 3 separate research scientists estimate that the rate is 10 times faster, at least 56,000 barrels a day, possibly as many as 84,000.
This has been terribly damaging for BP's reputation, particularly in the United States. Again and again, when we've heard about the oil spill from Obama administration officials,
the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico,
they've kept calling it the BP oil spill.
The BP oil spill
has been very, very tightly linked with the company.
The BP oil spill.
It's very much BP that this has stuck to. The stain is on BP's reputation.
There's an ironic PR backdrop to this story. In July of 2000, BP spent $200 million to overhaul its image. The company adopted a new logo and slogan, Beyond Petroleum, a signal to the world that the energy giant would be looking to a future less reliant on fossil fuels.
It's clear that British Petroleum has spent a lot of time and energy and money crafting a green or environmentally conscious image.
Could business go further and be a force for good?
Right from their logo, the colors, and more publicly, their advertising campaigns.
Beyond Petroleum.
The greening of BP's image was seen by some as a stroke of PR genius, putting the company out front of its competitors. However, environmentalists were skeptical, and 1 decade and one environmental disaster later, the skeptics have been proven right.
Certainly, there is a widespread sense out there that BP's being hypocritical. You quite often hear it from environmental campaigners that BP's being greenwashed. In other words, they're trying to put a green, environmentally friendly facade on a very dirty and polluting business, and then the environmentalists will say, well, look at this spill they've now had in the Gulf of Mexico. That's absolute proof of that point.
BP turned down our interview request, saying its media response was secondary to its response to the actual disaster. But on its website, bp.com, the company is greenwashing the spill. It features regularly updated pictures and video of the cleanup, but almost no images of the spill and the environmental impact. That's not surprising, given that BP's corporate future may well hinge on its ability to win government approvals for deeper, more intensive, and more widespread drilling. The more the media focus on the spill, the worse the future looks for BP and its drilling rigs.
The spreading oil slick.
We have seen a very significant PR push. We are getting reports of BP hiring people to help protect their image and to meet with the powers that be in the Gulf of Mexico to maintain their political advantage here and a friendly business atmosphere.
They are fighting a battle on a number of fronts, of which one of them is that they need to win the case that this is a technology that is safe.
Why wasn't something ready to go in the event of this kind of a disaster?
Well, this has never happened in 25 years in the industry.
That's why so much is being made of the technology that's being used to try and win the battle at sea. It's not just about getting the job done, but it's about being seen to get the job done, which could secure vital oil contracts in the future.
But as BP knows, future drilling contracts will be tougher to get after the disaster in the Gulf. And the media scrutiny goes well beyond the company, focusing on President Obama.
Today we're announcing the expansion.
Who just 3 weeks before the accident announced the lifting of restrictions on drilling in previously protected U.S. coastal waters. His timing proved unfortunate, and now every ounce of oil that gushes into the Gulf, every media misstep that BP makes, amounts to a bigger and bigger PR challenge, not just in the boardroom, but also in the Oval Office. Here's how our Global Village voices see the coverage of BP and the spill in the Gulf.
Well, I think there's no question that it's very damaging to BP's public image. It's a double PR disaster for them. It's a disaster for the image the company's been trying to portray for several years, and a personal disaster for the CEO. He really made it one of his core objectives to improve BP's safety record, and people were just saying that he'd really turned the company around. They were performing much better, and then this happened.
I think that overall the media have got it wrong, and the real story here is about Obama having an energy policy that sidelines environmental limits and the clean energy agenda in favour of vested interests, powerful lobbyists and campaign funders such as BP.
If you've got an opinion on the media that you'd like to get on the air as one of our Global Village voices, we suggest you join the thousands of our viewers who already follow us on Facebook and Twitter. They use those sites to find out what stories we're working on so they can weigh in. Or you can just get in touch with us via email at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Time now for Listening Post Newsbites. There are possible signs coming out of Australia that WikiLeaks, that whistleblowing website, is testing the patience of the authorities. Julian Assange, the co-founder of the site and an Australian citizen, was held up at customs upon entering the country, and he had his passport temporarily confiscated. WikiLeaks made headlines recently when it posted a cockpit video from a U.S. helicopter in Baghdad, which showed an attack that killed 14 Iraqis, including 2 journalists. Last year, WikiLeaks made waves in Australia when it published a list of websites that the country's communications regulator had officially blacklisted. Assange told the Australian network SBS1 that he got a letter from a lawmaker saying that the police are still investigating that leak. Julian Assange is turning into a global media player, even though he has no fixed address. He says he splits his time between Australia, Kenya, Sweden, and Iceland, never spending more than 6 weeks in one place and running his WikiLeaks site off his laptop, which he keeps in his backpack. 2 weeks ago, we aired that in-depth interview with Iranian-Canadian journalist Maziar Bahari, who spent 4 months in a Tehran prison last year. Well, now an Iranian court has convicted Bahari for, amongst other things, conspiring against the state and sentenced him in absentia to 13 years in prison and 74 lashes. Usually, people are convicted in absentia when the country in question cannot apprehend them, but Iran had Bahari in jail. Why would the authorities there allow him to be bailed out of jail, leave the country, and then convict him? Well, Bahari says he figures it was probably meant to send a signal to Iranian journalists to toe the government's line, since the first anniversary of last summer's protests is approaching and there are bound to be demonstrations. The feud between the Obama White House and Rupert Murdoch's Fox News network has been well documented. Now there's a report out that says the administration's a little closer to Mr. Murdoch than has been previously thought. Politico.com, the American site, reports that according to a new book by Newsweek columnist and MSNBC commentator Jonathan Alter, President Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, has kept a back channel open to the News Corp chairman and told Murdoch that the White House, quote, welcomed his ideas, unquote. That will not sit well with Obama supporters who have seen Fox attacking President Obama in all kinds of ways. Fox's Glenn Beck even called Obama a racist who hates white people. But the conservative Murdoch's very good at cozying up to political leaders he is ideologically apart from. He did the same thing with Tony Blair just before Blair became Britain's prime minister back in 1997. And one of Rupert Murdoch's many papers, the Wall Street Journal, is amongst the news outlets reporting that a potential new buyer for Newsweek has emerged. Israeli-American billionaire Haim Saban tried to buy Newsweek 2 years ago but was turned down. Now he's reportedly back in the mix for the American News magazine, which is currently owned by the Washington Post and was put up for sale last month. Saban made his money in media and entertainment and is reported to be worth about $2.8 billion. He's also a self-described hawk on matters relating to Israeli security. He was a big supporter over the years of former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and has made huge political contributions to both Bill and Hillary Clinton. Saban has also been linked in the past with possible takeovers at the Los Angeles Times and Newsweek's rival, Time magazine. We're back after the break. Did you read about that reporter getting kidnapped in Kabul? Probably not. Welcome back. Last week, we did a story on embedded reporting in which journalists travel within and live with the military units they cover. One of the rationales offered for this practice is security. Reporters are less likely to get killed or kidnapped when they're surrounded by armor and uniforms. Kidnapping has become a big issue in journalism, particularly in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But more and more often, you do not hear about such cases until the abducted journalists are freed. That's the way their news organizations want it. And usually, those organizations have one approach to reporting the kidnapping of, say, a soldier or an aid worker, and a different approach when it comes to reporting on one of their own. The Listening Post's Salah Qadar now on some cases in point and the ethics involved.
It can be a soldier carrying a weapon or a humanitarian worker bringing in aid. Both are at risk of being kidnapped.
The soldier was taken in Paktika province.
For an aid worker to be kidnapped in Afghanistan.
The men were taken captive by Taliban.
Of a captured American soldier being held by the Taliban.
And when that happens, the media usually have no qualms over running with that story.
Aid worker Margaret Hassan is another chilling symbol of how far terrorists will go.
The compelling photosensitive drama of the Westerner held captive behind enemy lines.
This American soldier being held captive by the Taliban in Afghanistan.
It's a reality of what sells news, and the kidnapping or arrests of aid workers, especially if they're attractive, they'll end up on the front pages.
And the journalists who cover kidnappings do that in the knowledge that if they're not careful, and even if they are, they can become kidnapped victims themselves.
We know of, so far this year, 19 who've been kidnapped since the beginning of the year, which is a serious figure. I mean, in the same period, we've had 42 or 44 journalists killed because of their jobs in that first 4 months. It's a serious problem.
There are many kidnaps of journalists across the globe, but we do not hear about every case every day, simply because of the choice of some media organizations to impose a blackout on the coverage of the kidnap of journalists.
We weren't sure who actually was kidnapping us.
The best-known case involved New York Times reporter David Rode, who was kidnapped in Afghanistan late in 2008. The Times reported nothing on the story and asked the same of other news organizations, arguing a media blackout would give Rode the best chance of survival. Al Jazeera was among the news outlets that agreed. Even Wikipedia made sure no one posted news of Rhode's abduction. Rode was held for 7 months before, he says, he escaped. Then, and only then, the story was reported.
I don't know the truth of it. There have been printed accounts that there were negotiations underway for a possible ransom, or there were bribes paid or whatever. The New York Times says, of course, there was no ransom paid. But if there were bribes involved, that's fine. I'm not so sure the blackout made any difference there at all.
What was unique about the Rode case was the blackout was almost entirely successful when it's really hard to keep a lid on that type of information. It seems pretty safe to conclude that the Times' influence and stature had something to do with the success of keeping that story out of the headlines.
Not necessarily. In 2008, Melissa Fung of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was abducted near Kabul and held for more than 3 weeks. Upon her release, she learnt that the CBC had asked for a media blackout and that, outside of a few news outlets in Afghanistan, her story went unreported.
I was surprised. I thought for sure it would already be in the media. Because as a journalist, right, you know, I'd want to report on it. But if you're talking about somebody's life, right, I think that sort of supersedes a good story. And I thank everybody for cooperating.
You know, journalism is a very clubby, cliquey type group. And I would imagine if one of us is in trouble, then we do tend to band together, put aside rivalries and hostilities and try and pull together.
Yvonne Ridley was captured in Afghanistan in 2001 whilst working undercover. She says she was accused of being a spy and thought her best chance to survive was to convince her captors she really was a journalist. The British government advocated a low-key approach. Her family did not.
My mother was broadcasting morning, noon and night against the government advice. She had Jack Straw, who was the then Foreign Secretary, on the phone saying, "You've got to stop doing this. You're endangering your daughter's life." She told him to get stuffed and put the phone down on him.
Welcome to the alleyways of Jabalia.
There was also a high-profile campaign when the BBC's Alan Johnston was kidnapped in Gaza and released after 4 months.
As you can see, I've been dressed in what is an explosive belt.
But that was 2007. The blackout strategy is a more recent trend, and the New York Times used it again last year when correspondent Stephen Farrell was taken in Afghanistan.
On Saturday, he was kidnapped along with his colleague Mohammed Sultan Munadi.
Farrell was quickly freed in a military raid, but his translator, Sultan Munadi, was killed. The first that the world heard about the kidnapping was when it was over, because that's the way the New York Times wanted it.
When a blackout, for example, is requested, it usually comes from the news organisation to which the person belongs, and it has come at the advice of the security experts. If these people are saying a news blackout is essential and can help save the life of the person, I think we're obliged to follow that advice.
But do media outlets give that same kind of consideration to other victims of kidnappings?
The Times and other media organizations who participated in the blackout, they routinely report on kidnappings of non-journalists, NGO workers, soldiers, businessmen. In fact, the Times reported on the kidnapping of a Greek social worker within a day of the kidnapping of Stephen Farrell. This failure to even address the double standard while claiming a self-evident moral high ground is intellectually dishonest, and it fails as a serious examination of journalistic standards and ethics.
And until the media dispense with the double standard, check with the families, for instance, before reporting on their stories, they leave themselves open to criticism. But the blackouts, when the media report on their own, look like they're here to stay.
It's hard to prove a negative. You know, if somebody comes out safe, You can say, oh, well, the blackout worked, or if somebody didn't come out, say, well, the blackout didn't work. As I say, the blackout is a key issue that will always be at the forefront of this debate.
More Global Village Voices now on the ethics of the reporting of stories of kidnapping.
Whether it be a normal citizen or in fact a journalist, it shouldn't really make any difference to whether or not a particular company should run with the story. However, a journalist is much less likely to run a story which might put another journalist in danger or in peril than it would in a normal citizen. Now, whilst that might be true, we have to ask the question, is that right?
In recent years, kidnapping is something that media organisations have sadly had to deal with on a more regular basis. News organisations will have to judge on a case-by-case basis how much or how little to report, but the involvement of their own staff in these situations means that journalists will hopefully be more aware of the risks of rushing out reports. So when a non-media person is kidnapped in the future, hopefully sounder ethical judgments will be made.
Finally, according to a tech analysis firm, about 40% of all internet users are on Facebook, and the time that they spend on the site accounts for about 8% of all time spent online. A lot of people are now bailing on Facebook because of concerns over security, and there's also a specific anti-social networking movement that has appeared online. The people behind it argue that we spend too much time in virtual communities, not enough time face-to-face dealing with people as opposed to their profiles. MODDR, the new media lab based in the Netherlands, wants to help people break their addictions to social networking, so they've devised something that they call the Web 2.0 suicide machine, which you can plug into to pull the plug on your social networking habit. We've turned some of the posts about the machine into our web video of the week, and if you'd like to see the video again, we will put it up on our Facebook page. See you next time at The Listening Post.
I used to be just like you, always online, chatting, poking. Things were okay, but I was really missing something. I was missing my family, and then something great happened. I discovered the Web 2.0 suicide machine, and things were about to change. You just go to www.suicidemachine.org and choose the network you want to be deleted from. The suicide server takes over now and logs into my account. Each action is automated. Slowly you see your online life passing away. It's exactly like they say the last minute of your real life is like. Look, there's so many people you actually didn't really care about. Hey, that's my kids. My internet life is dying, but my real life is starting. I'm gonna go and have fun with them now.